The massive spring offensive Vladimir Putin so easily drew on a map is now completely bogged down in the mud of the Ukrainian front. This strategic corridor stretching from Kursk and Belgorod to Luhansk, once intended to be the lifeblood of the Russian army, is no longer a secure supply line. It has turned into the world's deadliest drone trap. This is because Ukraine has built a flawless network that instantly paralyzes from the air every military convoy, armored vehicle, and infantry unit crossing its borders. Just think about it. You are trying to cross the borders of a country that produces exactly 3 million FPV drones a year and up to 20 kilometers deep into the front lines. Every second in the sky works against you. As Moscow's dream of sustaining the war by supporting it from its own borders shatters, this staggering geostrategic shockwave is now spreading to all fronts. Russian soldiers are now hesitating before taking their next step on the Ukrainian battlefield. The Donetsk-Zaporizhzhia corridor is perhaps the region where this anxiety is felt most intensely right now. This route is no longer an advanced zone for the Russian army. It is practically turned into a base swarming with drones. However, military strategists point to a much more specific front where even elite Russian soldiers would not want to enter. The Fortress Belt, a corridor running north-south along the H-20 highway. This place, especially in recent days, is handing Russia one of the heaviest defeats in its modern military history. The operational arrows that Vladimir Putin easily drew on the Fortress Belt map have been wiped away. Russian troops massing in the Pokrovsk direction are unable to make progress. Forces trying to cross the Oskol River in Kupiansk are scattering before they can consolidate their positions. Russian forces cannot receive reinforcements and refuse to surrender. Their only hope is a rescue operation that will never come. But in recent days, Russian infiltration groups on the geopolitical line cannot even get back out of the villages they entered. Even a Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger admitted that the situation in western Zaporizhzhia continues to deteriorate and that claims of the Russian command capturing some villages are completely false. In other words, all the Russian logistical bridges going to the Fortress Belt from both the south and the north are collapsing one by one. Surprising, but the situation is real. The beginning of spring brought the Russian army not the great victory it expected, but rather a massive logistical and operational nightmare. History reminds us of the staggering defeat Finland inflicted on the Soviet army in the winter conditions of the 1940s. Today, with similar determination, Ukraine is trapping the Russian military machine in the very pit it dug for itself. Now, even the world's most prestigious analytical institutions like the Institute for the Study of War are openly including this reality in their reports. According to ISW's April 6th analysis, Putin's strategic goals in Ukraine have entered a process of irreversible gridlock. So, what if we told you that the Fortress Belt could collapse entirely without a single bullet being fired? This is where Putin's second biggest mistake, a detail that might perhaps change the fate of the war, emerges. Russians, whose applications are expected by the Kremlin for conscription campaigns, do not even want to step foot on the front lines because people no longer want to risk their lives for nothing for the war strategy Putin wants to sustain. In other words, the failure on the front lines is not just a military bottleneck for the Kremlin. At the same time, this situation has become the official beginning of the psychological collapse of Russian society. Massive military casualties, thousands of soldiers not returning from the front, and constantly changing tactics have fundamentally shaken the Russian people's belief in this war. The Kremlin's recruitment centers are no longer overflowing like they used to. The propaganda wheels have come to a complete halt. People flatly refuse to give up their lives for a front line that has no strategic meaning left. The Russian Ministry of Defense had set a goal to recruit 49,000 new contract soldiers for the year 2026. This number was a critical threshold for the continuation of the war. At least 1 in 100 people needed to sign contracts daily, but the result is disastrous for the Kremlin. For 3 months, the daily average number of contracts remained at 940. We are talking about a performance 16% below the target. If this rate continues, Russia will face a shortage of at least 65,000 soldiers by the end of the year. But even the number itself doesn't paint the full picture, because in those same 3 months, the Russian army suffered nearly 89,000 casualties on the front, so the Kremlin cannot replace the soldiers it has lost. Major Robert Brody, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, clearly laid out this balance. Mr. Brody asserted that from December 2025 to the present day, for the fourth consecutive month, Russia's casualty rate has exceeded its recruitment rate. This means that an army has stopped growing and started to shrink. Statements by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Sirski, and data from the I Want to Live project clearly confirm this massive decline. According to the project's data, about 24% of the soldiers who signed contracts are under criminal investigation and 40% are in debt. Especially for the Kremlin, the effects of these military tremors have enveloped the megacities. In megacities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the recruitment rate dropped by 25% compared to last year. At least 12 Russian federal regions have increased Sinyan bonuses by between 50 and 80% since mid-February. Russian Minister of Science Valery Falov sent direct instructions to major universities. According to this instruction, it was claimed that at least 2% of students would be insured to sign a defense ministry contract. The governor of the Rion region sent an order to medium and large businesses telling them to choose soldiers from their employees. As we can see, bonuses and pressures are increasing, but the number of people signing contracts is decreasing. There's only one explanation for this. The Russian people no longer want this war. So what was the main reason that actually drove them away from this war? According to military strategists, the drone competition on the Ukrainian front lines is at the forefront of this psychological collapse. People can now more clearly predict what will likely happen to them on the battlefield because a drone that could suddenly drop can end everything. On this issue, Kiev made its biggest breakthrough in recent times, sending a major message of intimidation to Putin's soldiers on the front. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has managed to surpass Russia in the use of unmanned aerial vehicles. According to the latest data published by ABC News, Kiev sent far more drones into Russian territory in March than Moscow launched into Ukraine. By claiming to have shot down 7,347 Ukrainian drones, Russia actually confessed to how much pressure it is under in its own airspace. In response, Ukraine announced that it had successfully neutralized 6,462 drones and 138 missiles launched by Russia. The numbers are based on each side's own data, and there is always a margin of exaggeration, but the trend is indisputable. The needle in airstrike capacity has turned completely in Ukraine's favor, and this is not just a numerical superiority. It is a strategic revolution. Ukraine's drone operators are putting relentless pressure on critical infrastructure facilities deep inside Russia, far beyond the front lines. On the night of April 5th to 6th, Ukrainian forces attacked the Cheskirus oil terminal near the port of Novorossiysk in the Krasnodar region, starting a massive fire. That same night, Ukrainian drones also struck the Admiral Makarov frigate in the port. A Western security official told the Financial Times that Ukraine's recent attacks on the Primorsk oil port burned $200 million worth of oil. These attacks on oil revenues, the lifeblood of Russia's war budget, directly affect the money cut from the pockets of the soldiers on the front. But the real operational disaster is only just beginning for the Russian army. In a move that will revolutionize military technology history, Ukraine created a massive drone control zone exactly 150 kilometers behind Russian lines. This zone was 50 kilometers behind the front line just a few weeks ago. Now the current range ratio has tripled. Previously, Russian commanders could manage this narrow danger zone. They moved at night, avoided the riskiest routes, and risked a certain amount of loss. But at a depth of 150 kilometers, this calculation has completely collapsed. There is no longer a danger zone to bypass. Every convoy, every ammunition vehicle, every reinforcement unit trying to reach the front is now within drone range. Katerina Stinenko, an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, clearly summarized the goal of this strategy: to force Russian soldiers to walk long distances to reach their positions and ultimately collapse their ability to hold defense lines. This is a formula for defeating an army without directly attacking its manpower. You make the logistics chain feeding the front so deadly that the chain begins to crush under its own weight. There is a systematic campaign behind this expansion. Ukraine's Deep Strike Command Center dismantled Russia's drone interception capacity piece by piece. First, it hunted down electronic warfare units and air defense radars with heavy bomber drones called Nemesis. As these systems were knocked out, small FPV drones suddenly became able to fly farther and survive longer. Then the roof caved in. Dimoj Lukenko, an analyst from Ukraine's 413th Unmanned Systems Regiment, laid bare the gravity of the situation. According to the Analyst, in some regions, Russian troops began mounting machine guns dismantled from old Soviet attack helicopters onto trucks to use against drones. In other words, it's almost like a war fought with historical artifacts. Russia is losing rare air defense systems and radars in incredible amounts, and there is no way to replenish them quickly. Shevchenko said, this single sentence is the sharpest summary of Russia's desperation in the drone war. And while Ukraine gets better at this every week, Russia is growing increasingly weaker on the defensive. The situation has become so dire that even the Z bloggers, Russia's most fanatical war supporters, have raised the flag of rebellion. These figures, who used to spread the Kremlin's propaganda, are now openly criticizing this war waged by Putin. Ilya Ramoslo was one of the Kremlin's most loyal bloggers for years. On March 17, 2026, he published a manifesto. The title of this manifesto was 5 Reasons Why I Stopped Supporting Putin. Ramoslo directly accused Putin of failure in managing the war. He listed the Kremlin's lies one by one. This was the sharpest breaking point seen in the pro-war mill blogger circles since the beginning of the war. Actually, such people were the cogs in Putin's propaganda machine. Now those cogs are turning in reverse, and millions of Russians are getting their information about the war from these channels, not from state media. When they say the situation is a disaster, people take it seriously. And people who take it seriously don't sign contracts. It is not only Russian bloggers, but also important high-ranking officials who are reporting situation updates about Russia's tragedy on the front lines. Former CIA Director David Petraeus openly acknowledged this transformation of Ukraine in an interview he gave to CBS. Mr. Petraeus stated that despite Russia's massive superiority in troop numbers, weapons, and economic size, it is remarkable that the Ukrainian army has managed to hold back the offensive on the front line. He noted that in the last 2 months, Ukraine has made more concrete gains than Russia. So how does Ukraine achieve this? Is it only the drone war that brings key of these unexpected advantages? Actually, Ukraine doesn't just produce drones. They combine drones, intelligence, command and control systems, and real-time battlefield data into a single ecosystem. The Delta system instantly collects all this data and distributes it to every unit of the army. It is claimed that more than 2,000 Russian targets are marked with this system daily. Russia, on the other hand, probably has nothing equivalent to this. It has an army structure that works like independent islands with different units not sharing information with each other. This difference is much more decisive than numerical superiority. On the Russian front, however, the situation is very tragic. The Kremlin, let alone the soldiers on the front lines, cannot even protect its top generals flying over territories under its control. On March 31st, 29 people, including Major General Alexander Otrochenko, lost their lives when an AN-26 military transport plane crashed over Crimea. Moscow described this situation as a technical malfunction, but the possibility that air defense systems operating under the constant pressure created by Ukrainian drone attacks in Crimea open friendly fire is growing stronger. Because Otrochenko is the 15th Russian general to lose his life since the beginning of the war, these events may not just be bad luck. This could be evidence of a deep rot in the command structure and operational security. For an ordinary Russian soldier fighting on the front, this information is a moral collapse. If even generals are not safe, how can an infantryman be safe? Such losses remind us that Russia's room to maneuver in the Black Sea is narrowing a bit more every week. And in the midst of all this operational collapse, the Kremlin's economic decisions are also turning into a massive strategic waste. Russia allocated exactly $11.88 billion from the federal budget between 2024 and 2026 for the occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Karen regions. This is 3 times the spending made on about 20 regions of Russia, a massive amount spent in vain. For Russia, whose oil revenues are melting away with Ukraine's pinpoint attacks, this massive budget buried in the occupied territories is money cut from the throats of Russian soldiers fighting without ammunition and armor on the front. More than 600,000 Russian soldiers, currently estimated to be actively serving on the front, may face an unprecedented logistical crisis in the coming period. Weapon supply may become difficult. Armored vehicles may be abandoned due to a lack of spare parts, and technical equipment may be hunted down one by Ukrainian drones. The picture that is formed up to this point is quite clear. While the spring months warm the Ukrainian lands, for the Kremlin, this season signifies nothing but a massive strategic trap. The Russians have practically become unable to move in their own trenches in this war they started themselves. Declaring a general mobilization is the option Putin fears most because he knows he cannot control the reaction of the Russian people. But without mobilization, covering this casualty rate becomes mathematically impossible. Russia finds itself right in the middle of a dilemma, and this dilemma is narrowing a bit more every passing day. In the coming weeks, the focus may turn intensely to the Donetsk-Zaporizhia line because what happens here could determine the course of not just one front, but the entire war. While the critical weight continues on these important battle lines, the echoes of this disastrous picture on the front do not remain only within Moscow's borders. The real fire behind the front lines is happening exactly in these production facilities. Massive Soviet-era weapons factories like Eurovagon Zavad have reached the absolute limit of their production and refurbishment capacities. It is no longer just a matter of producing new tanks or armored vehicles from scratch. They are literally about to see the bottom of the rusty Soviet stocks that have been waiting in open-air depots in Siberia for decades. Russia, which brought these old vehicles out of depots and sent them to the front with superficial modernizations throughout 2024 and 2025, has entered a massive bottleneck by 2026 in procuring the most critical components like barrels, optical targeting systems, and engine blocks. Faced with Ukraine's high-tech, agile, autonomous networks integrated with the Delta system, Russia's obsolete quantitative production model is not only falling behind the times, but also accelerating the collapse of its own army. In addition to this, the logistical lines inside Russia are not only the target of cross-border Ukrainian drones, but are also falling victim to a silent wave of sabotage that is growing from within and becoming increasingly radicalized. The growing mysterious signaling failures, derailments, and transformer fires on massive military supply networks stretching from the Trans-Siberian Railway to Rostov show just how emboldened anti-war Russian partisans or local sabotage groups have become. The psychological detachment of the public who refuse to join the army is now giving signals of turning into an active resistance against the state's critical infrastructure. When this entire picture is put together, it stands clearly before us that it is not only infantry units or armored brigades that are stuck in the mud of the Donetsk steppes. Vladimir Putin's entire global industrial and strategic vision is no longer as effective as it used to be. Time, which was thought to be the Kremlin's most trusted ally at the beginning of the war, has now turned into a ruthless and unstoppable stopwatch working against Moscow. So, what do you all think about this? Could Putin's statement in the first days of the war that Kiev would fall in a few days have completely reversed today? Will Ukraine really be able to take back a large part of the territories occupied by the Russians in this war of attrition during this spring period? We await your comments, presented by TGM. Thank you for choosing us.